Today, we're examining the disturbing case of a young Indian mother who moved to the United States hoping to rebuild her marriage and secure a better future for her daughter. Just months after settling into her new life, she was found dead inside her apartment under circumstances that didn't match what they first appeared to be. What began as a routine call to emergency services quickly evolved into a complex investigation filled with hidden evidence, unanswered questions, and a dark history that no one around her had fully understood. In 2016, the annual Temple Festival in Puthupally drew crowds from nearby towns, including college students, families, and vendors. 19-year-old Ashanvi arrived with a small group of friends from her college hostel. She was described by those who knew her then as quiet, respectful, and focused on finishing her degree. She stayed close to her friends, watching the cultural programs and visiting food stalls. Nothing about her presence suggested that anyone would take unusual interest in her. Among the visitors that evening was 29-year-old Rudran from Adur. People later told investigators that he had always been fixated on leaving India, describing it as his single goal for years. Inside his home, his bedroom walls were covered with pictures of U.S. cities, printouts of visa instructions, and recruitment agency leaflets. Relatives recalled how he repeatedly said that a life abroad would finally prove his worth. At the festival, he noticed Ashanvi in the crowd and began asking others if they knew her. He spoke to a vendor, a college student, and a local family to gather basic information: her village, her family name, where she studied. Within days, he located her family's home and approached them under the pretext of a formal visit. Within weeks, he returned with his mother to present a marriage proposal. The Chenapan family was not wealthy, and the idea of their daughter marrying a man believed to be on track for a job in America seemed like a rare opportunity. Ashanvi was not convinced. According to her relatives, she told her parents she felt uncomfortable around him and did not want the marriage. When he visited again, she kept her distance and avoided long conversations. But the number of visits from his side increased. His mother insisted that he was a good boy with a great future. He made emotional appeals, promising her that he would never question her decisions and that he would improve himself. These repeated visits placed pressure on her parents, who felt they could not reject a proposal that seemed stable and socially advantageous. In 2017, the engagement was finalized and the marriage performed according to local customs. Video recordings from the ceremony show a typical family wedding: relatives smiling, rituals performed, and no visible sign of the problems that would emerge later. A few months into the marriage, she learned she was pregnant. Their daughter, Anvika, was born in 2018. For Ashanvi, the child became her primary source of strength, but the marriage was already showing signs of control and possessiveness. Family members later stated that the behaviors began subtly. If she spent extra time speaking to a neighbor, he questioned her immediately. If she received a phone call, he demanded to know who it was. Over time, these questions became interrogations. Friends observed that she reduced her social interactions and stopped attending gatherings to avoid conflict at home. By the time Anvika turned 1, relatives began noticing tension whenever the couple visited family functions. Despite these issues, both families continued to believe that the couple simply needed time to adjust. Discussions of migration added more pressure. Rudran repeatedly stressed that moving to the United States would solve their financial issues and give them a new start. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By 2020, he secured a position in Edison, New Jersey. He insisted that she join him first so they could stabilize their expenses and eventually bring their daughter when they were settled enough. Money concerns and Anvika's schooling costs continued to rise. Faced with the hope of securing a better future for her child, and after multiple conversations with relatives, Ashanvi agreed to travel ahead of the family. She reassured her daughter that she would return soon and bring her to America when everything was ready. In mid-2020, she boarded her flight, believing that geographic distance would soften the conflicts in her marriage and that starting over in a new country might restore stability. She did not realize she was stepping into a situation that would escalate far beyond anything she had experienced at home. When Eshanvi arrived in Edison, New Jersey, the shift in her surroundings was immediate. The temperature was colder than anything she had experienced back home, and the quiet inside the apartment complex felt unfamiliar. She and Rudran moved into a small unit in an older building off Oak Tree Road. The apartment was dim, with limited natural light, and most of the floor space was filled with unpacked boxes, plastic containers, and mismatched furniture they had picked up second-hand. Outside, the neighborhood had a strong Indian presence. She could hear Tamil and Malayalam conversations at the grocery stores, and restaurants advertised dosa specials on printed flyers taped to the windows. There were familiar smells, familiar clothing, and familiar products on the shelves, but inside the apartment the atmosphere was tense. She had no nearby relatives, no local friends, and no way to escape the confined space when arguments began. She spent the first weeks adjusting to the basics. She learned bus routes, watched online tutorials on how to apply for jobs, and created profiles on hiring websites. Her English was functional, but she practiced reading job descriptions carefully to avoid misunderstandings. Within a few months, she secured a position as a sales assistant at a retail store located in a shopping center about 15 minutes away. Her schedule varied, sometimes requiring evening shifts. To her co-workers, she appeared polite and hardworking, but they later told police they noticed she often avoided personal conversations. At home, the initial politeness from Rudran deteriorated quickly. He demanded to see her phone every night, claiming he wanted to check for safety. He examined her call log, message history, and even work-related chats. If he saw a male name, he questioned her immediately. When she explained that customers sometimes left feedback messages, he accused her of encouraging them. These incidents escalated into arguments that lasted hours. Neighbors on the same floor later reported hearing raised voices on multiple occasions. They described muffled shouting through the walls, sudden thuds, and hurried footsteps. At the time, none of them filed complaints, assuming the couple was adjusting to a new country. As months passed, alcohol became a regular factor. Rudran often returned from work with bottles hidden in plastic grocery bags. He drank late into the night, sometimes sitting on the floor, sometimes pacing around the apartment. Under the influence, his behavior changed sharply. Minor issues like a dish left in the sink or a light left unturned into long outbursts. He shouted accusations that made little sense and repeatedly insisted she was disrespecting him. The abuse shifted from verbal to degrading tasks. On several nights, after drinking heavily, he intentionally spilled alcohol on the kitchen floor, mixed it with crushed spicy food, and ordered her to kneel and clean it by hand. During one incident, he told her this was a test of obedience, adding that a good wife doesn't question. These actions caused both physical pain and psychological harm. Out of fear and shame, she began collecting evidence. She recorded short videos on her phone, aiming the camera toward him as he lifted chairs, threw household items, or advanced toward her. She also documented her own injuries, bruises along her arms, swelling near her jaw, and red marks on her legs. She sent these files to her sister and trusted friends in India, often late at night when he was asleep. In early 2021, her father, Devkant, flew to the United States after reviewing the disturbing videos. During his stay in the apartment, he personally witnessed several heated confrontations. On one occasion, he had to physically step between them to prevent the situation from escalating. He warned Rudran that if the behavior continued, the family would intervene formally. In front of him, Rudran promised to change and acted cooperative. However, as soon as Devkant returned to India, the temporary restraint ended. The same patterns resurfaced: arguments, accusations, and late-night drinking. By then, Eshanvi began telling her family clearly she no longer felt safe, and she wanted to return home permanently. On an October evening in 2021, the routine inside the Edison apartment appeared normal from the outside. Eshanvi finished her shift at the retail store, returned home, and prepared a simple dinner. She made her usual video call to her daughter, 6-year-old Anvika, who was living with grandparents in India. People close to the family later said the call lasted several minutes, and nothing in her tone suggested immediate danger. She told the child she was proud of her school progress and promised that they would meet soon. Afterward, she sent brief messages to her sister, mentioning that she felt tired but hopeful about organizing a visit home in the coming weeks. Before going to sleep, she responded to a coworker who had asked about shift coverage. In that message, she wrote that she planned to ask her manager for a few days of leave to travel to India. According to the coworker's later statement, her message was coherent and did not indicate distress. What happened between that night and the following morning remained central to the case. At 7:14 a.m. the next day, a 911 call was placed from the apartment. The caller, identifying himself as her husband, reported that he had returned from an early work shift and found his wife hanging inside their bedroom closet. The dispatcher recorded his voice as shaking and disorganized. Edison police units were dispatched immediately. Officers arrived within minutes. Several neighbors, awakened by the sound of emergency vehicles, later told investigators they saw police running upstairs to the couple's unit. A few said they noticed the front door slightly open before officers entered. Inside the second-floor apartment, responders found 23-year-old Ishanvi suspended from a dupatta knotted around the metal closet rod. She was unresponsive. Initial visual assessment noted no signs of forced entry, no broken furniture, and no apparent disturbance in the main room. Rudran repeated to officers that he had come home early, noticed the bedroom door partly open, and discovered her inside. According to the responding officer's notes, he stated that she had been under stress, missed her daughter, and had argued with him earlier in the week. Paramedics checked for vital signs but found none. She was pronounced dead at the scene shortly afterward. Standard procedures followed, photographs were taken, the area was secured, and her body was transported to the Middlesex County Medical Examiner's office. The initial police report labeled the incident as an apparent suicide. Within hours, the first autopsy confirmed death by hanging and designated the manner of death as suicide. The report did not flag any major external injuries requiring further analysis. When the news reached her family in India, they immediately objected. They possessed months of documentation from her recordings of shouting, pictures of bruises, descriptions of degrading treatment, and messages describing physical assaults. To them, the idea of suicide contradicted everything they had seen and heard. They contacted the Indian consulate in Houston, provided samples of the evidence, and formally requested that her body not be released for cremation until a second forensic examination could be conducted. Because the body had not yet been released to any funeral home, authorities could honor the request. The consulate communicated directly with local officials, and the Middlesex County Medical Examiner approved a second examination under supervisory review. This decision marked the turning point of the case. Within the next 48 hours, a second, more detailed autopsy was performed. The results of that examination would sharply diverge from the first and redirect the investigation entirely, laying the foundation for what followed. The second forensic examination was carried out within 48 hours of the family's request. This time, the assessment was performed by a senior medical examiner who had been provided with the videos, photographs, and written messages documenting the months of abuse. Unlike the first examination, which focused primarily on the ligature mark, this reevaluation covered her entire body with detailed photographic and microscopic analysis. During the external inspection, the examiner documented more than 40 separate injuries. These findings were itemized in the report. Deep bruises were present along both upper arms and thighs, with several at different stages of healing, indicating repeated trauma. Along her back, there was a patterned contusion, a narrow linear mark consistent with being struck by a rigid object, possibly a household item. Abrasions on her face suggested recent blunt force contact. On both hands, the examiner noted defensive wounds, small cuts, and abrasions consistent with a person attempting to block an assault. The neck findings were the most significant. While there was evidence of a ligature impression from the dupatta, the internal structures did not match a typical self-suspension pattern. There were asymmetric pressure marks and localized bruising beneath the jaw, areas more consistent with manual strangulation. The examiner noted that these injuries would not have been produced by the type of hanging described by the initial report. In short, the physical evidence did not support suicide. Parallel to the second autopsy, detectives in Edison began re-examining digital evidence. Investigators obtained access to backups from her phone stored in cloud storage. From these, they retrieved multiple deleted voice notes and short video clips. One audio recording, timestamped roughly 3 weeks before her death, captured her whispering that she had been held by the throat again and didn't know how much more she could handle. In another clip, only a few seconds long, a loud crash could be heard, followed by her crying. These recordings had not been included in the initial police review because they were deleted at the device level but still recoverable from the cloud. Detectives also returned to the apartment complex to conduct follow-up interviews. One neighbor reported hearing a heavy thud early in the morning on the day of the incident, a noise they initially dismissed as someone dropping furniture. Another neighbor stated that in the weeks leading up to the event, they heard frequent arguments and what sounded like a woman crying through the shared wall. These statements contradicted earlier assumptions that the household had been quiet. Investigators then compared Rudran's account of his movements with electronic records. He claimed he had left the apartment for work at approximately 5:30 a.m. that morning. However, phone tower logs and app activity showed his device remained connected to the home network well past that time. In addition, location data from a commonly used navigation app indicated no evidence that he had actually begun a commute at the time he claimed. These inconsistencies raised immediate concerns about the accuracy of his timeline. The cumulative findings: injuries inconsistent with self-harm, digital evidence revealing ongoing violence, neighbor statements confirming disturbances, and contradictions in the husband's story shifted the case from suspicious to clear-cut. The Middlesex County Medical Examiner formally reclassified the manner of death as homicide. Based on the updated forensic report and supporting evidence, an arrest warrant was issued. Later that week, officers took Rudran Vimula into custody without incident. The case, once treated as a suicide, had now fully transitioned into a homicide investigation. After the death was formally reclassified as a homicide, the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office advanced the case with unusual speed. Investigators organized the material gathered from the second autopsy, the recovered digital files, and the expanded witness interviews. Their priority was to build a clear, chronological timeline of escalating domestic violence that demonstrated intent, opportunity, and motive. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and prepared for presentation. Prosecutors began by establishing a pattern of abuse. They relied heavily on the videos and voice notes recovered from cloud storage. Each clip was timestamped and verified through metadata. These recordings showed repeated incidents in which Rudran shouted aggressively, lifted a chair, or moved toward her in a threatening posture. In one, she could be heard crying. In another, she described that he had grabbed her by the throat. The prosecution used these files to demonstrate that the violence was not isolated or incidental, but ongoing and severe. Next, prosecutors focused on the victim's intentions. They presented messages she had sent to her sister and friends stating she planned to return to India permanently. They also showed her final communications from the night before her death, where she discussed requesting leave to travel home. These messages were used to counter any suggestion that she was suicidal or emotionally unstable. From the prosecutor's perspective, her mindset was clear: she intended to leave, and she had begun making practical steps toward that decision. The prosecution then addressed motive. Their argument was that Rudran feared losing control. They showed his pattern of interrogating her about coworkers, checking her phone, and reacting violently to perceived slights. They linked this behavior directly to the escalation shortly before her death. They emphasized that when an abusive partner believes he is losing control of the victim, the risk of lethal violence increases significantly. To support the theory of staging, prosecutors referenced the forensic diagrams from the second autopsy. The examiner's report detailed how the internal neck injuries were inconsistent with self-hanging and more aligned with manual strangulation. They showed diagrams illustrating asymmetric pressure marks and injuries beneath the jawline. They also presented evidence that the closet scene had no clear signs of a struggle, raising the possibility that the placement was deliberate. The defense attempted to challenge these points. They argued that some injuries documented in the second autopsy were from previous domestic incidents, not from the night of her death. They claimed she was emotionally overwhelmed by the distance from her daughter and unfamiliar surroundings. They suggested that Rudran's behavior in the videos was the result of stress, alcohol misuse, and cultural adjustment problems. Defense attorneys tried to frame the case as a tragic suicide compounded by misinterpretations of physical evidence. However, during trial, the videos had a strong impact on the jury. They saw him shouting, pacing aggressively, and lifting objects during drunken confrontations. They heard her voice recorded in fear. Digital forensic experts testified about the recovery of deleted files and confirmed the authenticity of timestamps. Forensic pathologists explained in straightforward terms why the injuries did not match a self-inflicted hanging. Neighbors testified about noises, crying, and disturbances they heard in the weeks before the incident. Throughout the trial, the prosecution returned to a single argument: her actions contradicted any suicidal intent. They pointed to her savings for travel, her scheduled workplace leave request, and her ongoing communications with her daughter. In their closing statement, they summarized the core of their case: a woman who documents her injuries, records her abuser, and makes plans to return home does not end her life the next morning. By the end of the evidentiary phase, the prosecution had established a clear narrative supported by forensic science, digital evidence, and witness accounts. The case presented to the jury was not one of uncertainty but one of deliberate violence. The trial at Middlesex County Superior Court lasted a little over 3 weeks. By the time closing arguments were delivered, both the prosecution and defense had presented dozens of exhibits, digital files, forensic diagrams, and witness testimonies. The courtroom was consistently filled with observers from the local Indian community, victim advocacy groups, and residents who had followed the case since the homicide ruling. The jury consisted of individuals screened specifically for their ability to evaluate domestic violence evidence without bias. During the final days of the trial, jurors reviewed every key piece of material. They examined still images taken from videos showing prior incidents of aggression inside the Edison apartment. They listened again to voice recordings recovered from the victim's cloud storage, including one in which she described being grabbed by the throat. They analyzed phone location data contradicting the defendant's timeline. The prosecution instructed them to consider each point not in isolation but as part of a broader pattern. The defense attempted to emphasize uncertainties. They argued that the recorded incidents did not prove intent to kill. They stated that the victim's injuries could have accumulated over time and that the staging theory was speculative. They also repeated the suggestion that emotional strain from living abroad and being separated from her daughter could not be discounted as contributing factors. Despite these claims, jurors had access to the full second autopsy report, which clearly outlined neck injuries inconsistent with self-inflicted ligature hanging. Forensic experts had explained the findings in plain language, clarifying why manual strangulation was the only medical conclusion supported by the evidence. In the final hour of prosecution argument, the state summarized the entire case: a consistent pattern of coercive control, a rapid escalation of violence, clear evidence of fear expressed by the victim, and forensic contradictions that eliminated the possibility of suicide. The prosecutor stated that the defendant removed her right to leave, describing the homicide as the final act of control. After receiving instructions from the judge, the jury retired to deliberate. According to courtroom observers, deliberations progressed methodically. Jurors requested to review certain exhibits again, including diagrams illustrating the internal neck injuries and the recovered messages discussing her plan to return to India. They also asked to rehear portions of testimony from the digital forensic analyst who explained the recovery of deleted files. Deliberations concluded sooner than many expected, lasting only a little over 1 full day. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere became silent. The foreperson delivered the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of aggravated assault involving domestic violence, and guilty of evidence tampering. The defendant showed no visible reaction when the verdicts were read. Sentencing followed at a later hearing. The judge reviewed the aggravating factors, including the pattern of abuse, the attempts to stage the crime scene, and the vulnerability of the victim. The court imposed life imprisonment with a lengthy period of parole ineligibility. In delivering the sentence, the judge stated that the severity of the conduct required the strongest possible penalty under state law. For the victim's family in India, the verdict brought formal acknowledgement of what they had insisted from the beginning, that their daughter's life had been taken through violence, not by her own hand. Although the ruling could not reverse the loss, it provided legal confirmation of the truth they had worked to expose. Her daughter, now living under the care of her grandparents, grows up hearing accounts of her mother's persistence and the efforts taken to ensure her story was told accurately. The conclusion of the case marked the point at which a death first labeled as suicide was publicly recognized as a homicide proven in courtroom.